But I remember the paramedics whispering to the officer, he's not going to make it.
This episode of Wildlife Podcast contains adult themes and subjects that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. In 2001, the earliest evidence of a home occupied by mankind was discovered in Wonderwork Cave in South Africa's Kalahari Desert and is estimated to be 2 million years old. It seems from the dawn of time, humans have sought shelter from the outside world. From temporary shelters, mud huts, and caves, humans have always tried to keep the outside world out. And for most of us, our home offers sanctuary. It becomes an extension of ourselves. It allows us to break free from the worry and peril we face while navigating through society. But what happens when evil slips in? When you are made to be the victim in the one place you are meant to feel the safest? To have your life as well as your sense of security jeopardized by an external threat? Everyone you meet has a story. This is Boy Jerry's.
This is Boy Jerry out of Brooklyn, New York. I was living in a middle-class neighborhood. There were a lot of elderly people there. I lived in a very a nice house. Directly across, I could stand in my kitchen and look out the window and see directly into the police station. This is how close I was to the police station. I liked the community. I felt very safe living there because I lived alone at the time. I had just came out of I was going through divorce, I should say, at the time. And I felt very safe living there. At the time, I ran a small used car dealership, and that was my auction day. So usually I would go to the auction on, I believe it was a Monday, on Monday afternoons. So that day I had waken up, went over to the bank and got some money out to buy cars because sometimes I will buy in cash. So that morning, earlier that day, I had went over to the bank. I got some money out to make the purchase. I came home. I put the money up in the house. And I remember going to eat lunch. I ate lunch that afternoon at my favorite Japanese hibachi place. And coming back home, that was pretty much it. My only two trips that day was going to the bank to get the money out. And the second trip was going out to get some lunch. I came home, and as I'm walking towards the house, I noticed that my front door was not fully closed, man. And I'm looking at the door, and I think to myself, I know I shut my door, but then something in my mind is telling me, well, maybe you closed the door, and you know how sometimes you will close your door and the door will bounce back and open behind you. So I'm convincing myself that, hey, perhaps you may have closed the door and the door may have bounced back behind you, X, Y, Z. And I just couldn't understand it until I got to the door. I pushed the door and I entered inside, and the war started. When I walked into the house, they were there waiting on me. Apparently, they were watching for me to drive up, and they were fully aware that I had just gotten home. When I walked there, he met me at the front door. Their faces were covered, and I looked at these guys. I've never seen them before. I didn't know who to wear. There was no reason for me to have any type of suspicion. I lived a very low profile life, so I didn't expect that someone would come after me. I was fairly new to the neighborhood. I believe I've only been there about 3-4 months. So for me, that was very, very disturbing. And the shock of just walking in and looking at strangers, I just can't explain that feeling. I can't explain that feeling. At one point I felt dumb, like maybe when I saw the door partially open, perhaps I should have just not came home. But I don't know what my other choices would have been. I really don't know. I was living alone. I couldn't call a friend and say, "Hey, come with me." There was no reason for me to feel that anything out of the ordinary was happening. So maybe that was where there was a lot going through my mind when I came through that door and I met the first guy. There was a lot going through my mind. Moments later, that's when the second voice sounded from behind me. When I first walked in, there was only one guy that was there, and initially I did not realize that it was two people in the house. The other guy was still back in the bedroom, going through the closet and flipping over things, still looking for apparently for money back in the back room. So I did not even realize that it was two people initially when I met the first gunman at the door. The first shooting happened within 5 minutes of me walking in the door. It was very graphic. When And I still have memories today as if I'm still reliving those experiences. And it's a wonder that I'm able to bypass those experiences. But I could tell you when the first bullet hit, it hit me on the right side of my lower back and exited through my stomach in the front. That bullet ripped my stomach apart. That first bullet, all the food that I ate for lunch fell out of my stomach on the floor, on my shoes, on the doorknob, on the door in front of me. All over my clothes were rice grains. After this first shooting, that we were in there going through this horrific situation for at least another hour and a half at the very least. I realized at that point that I was getting ready to die. The first shooting was at least 20 minutes before that second shooting, or maybe off here and there. Who was counting? But after the second bullet hit, something happened. The second bullet hit me from the front. The first one was from the back. When the second bullet hit me, it literally knocked me off my feet. I felt the second bullet a lot more than I did the first one, but the second bullet actually lifted me off my feet and threw me across the bed onto the other side of the room. I remember landing on the floor as I'm laying there, holding trying to stuff my shirt into the bullet hole. I'm just laying there thinking like, wow, I'm getting ready to die. I have to think of something. I got to think of something fast. I can't fight them. Oh my God. So I'm laying there. I'm racing through different thoughts. I couldn't even believe I was alive. When I landed on the floor, the sound from the bullet was still ringing in my ear. I could still hear the ringing sound. And I was looking at it. I started yelling, no, don't shoot. Please don't shoot again. I remember that. But I wasn't really there. At that point, I thought I was really dead. I had to, it took me a few minutes to recollect. And after I recollected, that was when I had to realize that they are going to kill me. There's no other way. They are going to kill me. When I made that realization, I had to start thinking very fast about how I could escape. I started thinking crazy things, that even if they kill me, let them kill me outside where somebody's going to find my body, rather than my body's rot for days. So I started planning how I was going to escape. I was able to trick them at that point. So I tricked him into believing that there was perhaps more money somewhere else. That if he didn't kill me, that by saving my life, that he was going to get all this other money. In the course of that, I guess they started to trust me, and that they were believing me a little bit more, and I was getting deeper and deeper into this illusion that there was more money in it, that perhaps that I was perhaps wrong for doing this to them and treating them this way, that and wasting their time, that I should have just told them the truth from the very beginning, and I wouldn't be in that situation. I kind of took kind of a different approach to them, and I could see that they were starting to fall for it and starting to believe it. So that made it easier for me to push this whole idea to them that I had more money if they just stopped shooting and just quit and just relax. I would give them the money, and I would not tell the police who they are. And I reassured them that, hey, I don't even know who you are. Your faces are covered. I've never seen you guys before. I was able to create my escape. And during the escape was when I was shot the third time. They shot me in my back. But I landed in the street, at least at that point. I was somewhere where I could be found. I did not feel the third bullet that hit me in my back. I did not feel it. After I crawled to the middle of the street, I looked across the street. The third house in front of me to my right, I would never forget this. There was an elderly lady sitting on the porch. And when I was able to crawl from the front door to the middle of the street, I remember lifting my head up and looking towards the lady and saying, "I've been shot. Get me some help. I'm dying. I've been shot." She was the person that called 911. I never had the chance to meet this lady, but she was the person that called 911 after the shooting. I was semi-conscious at the time, but I remember the officer kind of walking towards me from the direction of the police station, kind of walking real fast because I was laying there and traffic was starting to stop to look to see what was going on. And then I started to blink in and out. There were moments where I would come in, I would go out, and not long after that, I heard the sirens in the distance. I heard sirens ringing, and a female and a male paramedic arrived on the scene. I do still remember that very well. Uh, but I wasn't able to communicate fully. I was conscious, but I wasn't fully conscious. I was aware of what was going on around me. My ears were fully alert. I could hear, but I couldn't vocalize. By the time the paramedics got to the scene, I was somewhat conscious, but there were parts I could remember, and there are parts I really don't remember. But I remember the paramedics whispering to the officer. He asked if I had a pulse, and they said yes, he got a pulse, but she whispered something. My eyes were open. I was somewhat unconscious, and she whispered something to the officer like he's not going to make it. And that was the first experience for me that I had with death. That me looking at someone that I knew I had been shot 3 times. I had just went through the experience and looking at the paramedics telling the officer and they having this exchange that I wasn't going to make it. For me, was my first horrific experience in the whole ordeal. It was more terrifying as the shooting itself. I woke up about 2 days later out of a coma, and the doctor looked me in the face and he said, "Let me tell you something." He said, "You are lucky to be alive." He said, "We got to tell you, you made it through a lot." He said, "But in making this, we have to tell you that over half of your stomach is going to be plastic moving forward for the rest of your life. We had to remove one of your kidneys because of the bullets. We had to remove part of your liver, and we had to do a complete reconstruction on your inside. You are not going to be able to do a lot of things that you were able to do before. Among those things, this colostomy bag that is attached to your stomach is something that you are going to have to live with for the rest of your life." And I still remember as he continued talking, just processing that part of the information, tears started to come out of my eyes as I was laying in that bed. And he said, "You are going to walk." He said, "Don't force it. Take your time. Gradually, you're going to walk. And you're just not going to be able to walk the same way you were able to walk before. And good thing you have children because you are not going to be able to perform as a man anymore. Because the last bullet that hit in your back did some damage." And those words touched me in a lot of ways on a lot of different levels. What really touched me in those words, particularly, was the fact that I had been injured. I had been injured by these assailants And then yet, for the rest of my life, that was going to be my fate. That was something that I had struggled with from the very hour that he told me what the future was going to look like for me. I lay there and I remember my mom wiping the tears off my face. And I just kept saying, God, why? Why at this age? I mean, I'm not the greatest person on earth, but I've been a fair enough person that why is this going to be my fate? And as the days progressed in the hospital, I just started to tell myself, this is not going to happen. They got to be crazy. I am not going to spend my life on a colostomy bag. It's no way. I'm not going to walk in crutches or in a wheelchair. That is not going to be my. And I started to inspire myself. And what's really interesting is that I started to look out for people that I could find inspiration from while I was in this hospital. I wanted someone to just be able to tell me, you know something? You can make it. Just believe it. And I wasn't able to find that in the hospital. I was able to find a lot of rehabilitation. They were able to tell me when to get up to take medications. But there was nobody that I could look to say, hey, man, I have been through a very, very horrific experience just like this. This is not the end of the world. The way that you are feeling, the motivation that you are feeling to be able to go to the next level, it's possible. Just believe in yourself and do it. There was nobody there to be able to motivate me in that respect. There's a saying that goes, whenever the going gets tough, the tough gets going. After a month of being in there, of suffering, of knowing that the future was going to contain a colostomy bag attached to my side, and I wasn't going to be able to do the things I was used to doing, I decided that I was going to take matters into my own hands. So I decided to find someone that would be able to help me to escape from the hospital so that I could be able to go home and try to figure out if I could heal myself. So the first person I talked to was my mother, and she, of course, she cursed me out and told me that I have got to be crazy. I must don't like my life, and I must want to die. What type of craziness is that I'm talking? So I decided that maybe I'll talk to someone that I was dating at the time. And of course, she was against the idea as well. So I couldn't figure out, I just couldn't get nobody on board. And I just kept telling myself, hey, man, this is my life, you know. And it's bad, but I felt that not trying to do more for me was more destructive than me just at least trying to push myself. And I just kept telling myself, just don't listen to them, don't listen to them. And one day I got fed up. I waited. I had pretty much figured out the schedule for the nurses, what time they came by to do vitals and XYZ. And so I waited. And after the nurse was finished doing the vitals, I asked her again. I said, I want to leave the hospital. I don't want to be here. She said, there's no way you can leave. And at the time, I had a whole bunch of things attached to my arms, drapes, and what have not. I had them attached. And I had already planned my escape because I had got the number to the local taxi. So I figured that I was going to leave. I had some clothes there, and I waited until about 3 in the morning. I knew that about 6 they would be coming back through, or 5, between 5 and 6, that the nurse was going to be coming back through to do her checks before changing shifts. So I got out of bed and I pulled out the drapes and things out of my arm. I pulled everything out and pulled a band-aid. I was still bleeding on one of the things that I had pulled out. I pulled a band-aid over it. I got dressed while I was laying down because I was in too much pain to stand up, but I had enough strength to be able to push my legs through a pant and put on a shirt and take off the hospital gown. So I was able to do that, and then I got the walker. They had given me a walker. I got the walker, and I had my cell phone. I called the taxi, and I took a taxi and went back home that day. And the rest was history. It was very terrifying going back to that house. My options were limited at the time. The person that I was involved with, I certainly couldn't have went to her house because she don't want to be the person responsible for my death, because that's how they were looking at it at the time, that if you leave the hospital, you're going to die. And I certainly couldn't go back to my mother's or my family. No one was willing to welcome me back into the house. I wasn't able to go into a hotel in that condition because my stomach was literally still open. I could take off my shirt and look past the stitches and be able to see my abdominal at the bottom. So my stomach was literally still open and covered with plastic. So my options were limited. So I did not want to go back to that house. That was not something that I intended or was happy about doing, but my choices were limited. Just as I felt my choices were limited, staying in the hospital, I felt that those choices were limited as to how many places I could have went. So I went right back into the same house. The first thing I had to figure out was how to be able to get my hands on someone that could help me with the situation. So I went over to the internet and I started researching about my injuries that I had and what it took for me to be able to heal. I started to look into different options at home. I had watched the nurses how they managed the wound, so I tried to imitate that to a certain degree. By then, my family had no choice. Everyone had to get on board. They accepted the fact that I had negated the treatment, and I decided to go home and self-treat. So people came on board and they brought me a whole bunch of bandages and over-the-counter medical things. And I even remember the hospital sending over, before they could prescribe any sort of pain relief or medications for me, that I needed to sign a medical release that I walked out of the hospital without permission. And I remember signing that at home and sending it back to the hospital, that I was refusing to the in-house treatment. And from that point, I was able to get some antibiotics and some painkillers. The recovery process for me lasted roughly within 3 to 4 months. I was able to return to the hospital and ask them to examine me. They were able to find that my stomach was back functioning and that they had to do an emergency surgery to remove the colostomy bag. And that was within 3 months of me walking out of the hospital. And at that point, I still wasn't fully healed. So I would give or take another 2 or 3 months added to that after the bag was removed from my body to fully heal and get back to normalcy. The assailants were never caught, and the case was closed prematurely. I am not looking for the case to be reopened. I'm not looking to rehash old wounds. I just want to be able to go out and let the world look at me and be inspired by what I have been through, and be able to get something. If I'm able to inspire one person, I feel that I've accomplished a lot. The message here is, look at me. The doctor said I wasn't going to live. The paramedics said I wasn't even going to make it to the hospital. Look how far I've come. Look how much I've accomplished. I'm successful. I have overcame, or I would say fully recovered from those injuries. I rarely think about them. I only think about them as inspirational tools. Well, I don't think about them in terms of being obstacles to stand in the way, because there are no obstacles for me. The sky is the limit. And I want people to be able to look at me and look at my accomplishments, look at my life, look at how far I've come, and be motivated by that once they know the story. Trauma is a horrible thing, but I believe that hanging on to those trauma can be even more disturbing and even more harrowing. For me, moving on was something that I felt that was mandatory. My moving on started when I walked out of the hospital. For me, that was the beginning of the moving on and being able to move past that process. So that journey of recovery for me started the night that I decided, or the morning that I decided, that I am going to leave this hospital and take this healing process into my own hands. First, God, I prayed a lot. I'm a praying person. I believe in prayers for my family, my friends, and those people that believe in me. And most importantly, it was the blessing from God, because nobody could believe that I was able to survive 3 bullets. Most people are succumb 1 bullet. The guys were using a 9mm handgun. This was a pretty serious. God just didn't want this to happen. And secondly, I was determined that it wasn't going to happen. So I believe my philosophy kind of takes a twofold here. I believe God comes in first and foremost, but you have to have the determination and the courage and the willpower to want to live. You have to love life itself to want to live, and you have to have the willpower to want to overcome those type of traumas. I could sit somewhere and be traumatized, or I could move on and be able to enjoy the rest of my life. The problem here is that if I choose to sit somewhere and continue to be traumatized, is that the assailants continue to win. That's something that I'm not willing to accept. From my end, there is going to be no victory for my assailants.
Wildlife Podcast is produced, hosted, and edited by me, Brandon Pennington. Music, sound design, and additional editing by Dan Semin. If you or someone you know has a story that you would like to share on the podcast, you can reach out to us directly at wildlifepod1@gmail.com. That's wildlifepod, the number 1, @gmail.com. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you'd like to support the show, you can leave us a 5-star review on Apple iTunes, and remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen to the podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at wild-life-podcast to stay up to date on new episodes, bonus content, or just to send a message and say hi. Hey guys, stick around after this brief sponsor break for a few final thoughts on this week's episode. Hey guys, thanks for sticking around to the end of this week's episode. As always, we'll be back again in 2 weeks with a brand new episode. But until then, if you'd like to learn more about Boy Jerry, you can go to www.boyjerry.com, or you can follow him on Facebook at facebook.com/boyjerry. Boy Jerry does have a book coming out soon, so if this episode is something that interests you, make sure to follow him for the release of that book. If you're wondering how you can support the podcast, you can subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It really does help a lot. You can also follow us on social media at wild-life-podcast. We're on Instagram and we're on Facebook. If you guys share anything related to the podcast, make sure to tag us and we'll definitely give you a shout out on our social media as well. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you guys so much.